Hi there, sixth graders. This is World History, Chapter 14, Lesson 4, Crusades, Trade, and the Plague. I start on page 406. Do follow along. Main idea: routes promoted trade, travel, and communication, as well as the plague between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Got a list here of some vocabulary and places. Palestine, Rome, Chang'an, Dunhuang, Genoa, Alexius Comnenus, Urban II, Marco Polo, Epidemic, Crusades, Silk Road, Plague, and Bubonic Plague. But first, you are there. Hooray! It's your 14th birthday, and your parents are sending you to work as a squire to Sir John. You will go on the second crusade with him. You will act as his servant much of the time. But best of all, you will be in charge of Sir John's chain mail armor. It's a great responsibility. Sir John has the latest in armor technology. His chain mail has hundreds of iron rings linked together. It looks like mesh. Even his horse wears some chainmail armor. Sir John's armor weighs about 50 pounds. Sir John will need your help getting in and out of his armor. Once he is in it, you will hand him his weapons. These include a two-edged sword to hang from his waist and a dagger to tuck into his belt. After you help him onto his horse, you will hand him his lance and battle axe. Then, because of your help, Sir John will be ready for battle. The Crusades. After Charlemagne, battles for religion meant that more and more Christian knights were needed to fight. 200 years earlier, Islam had spread through North Africa and Asia Minor. Lands to the north and west of the Mediterranean Sea were mainly Christian. Lands along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean were Muslim. In the mid-1000s, a group of Muslim Seljuk Turks from Central Asia rose up and defeated the Byzantine army. This marked the decline of Byzantine control over Asia Minor. During this time, the Turks conquered many lands, including Palestine. In the 1st century, Judea had been renamed Palestine by the Romans, who then forced the Jews to leave the region. Christians considered Palestine the Holy Land. According to the New Testament, this is where Jesus had lived and preached. In the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, Islam had gradually replaced Christianity, and the Turkish language had replaced Greek. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus asked Pope Urban II in Rome for help. He wanted Christian knights to fight against the Turks. Urban II responded by issuing a plea to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. I, Urban, by the permission of God, have come into these parts as an ambassador to you, the servants of God. Between 1095 and 1214, Christians in Western Europe responded by organizing 8 major military expeditions called the Crusades. Kings, nobles, knights, peasants, and townspeople became crusaders and set out to win back control of Palestine. East and West. The Crusaders marched to the east to win control of the Holy Land. Many of the Crusaders also fought for themselves. They sought to increase their power, territory, and riches. The Crusades occurred at a time when Western Europe's economy was expanding. Its military forces were increasing. The Crusaders won some battles. They established Crusader states along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Although their victories had no permanent effect on the rule of the region, the Crusades increased the contacts between the East and the West. These contacts led to additional trade and commerce. Trade grows. During the early Middle Ages, in about 1000, people had what they needed to produce their own food, clothing, and shelter. Occasionally, they might barter goods for goods produced elsewhere. However, over time, people began to need and want goods that were not available on the manor. Serfs needed iron for better farming tools. Lords wanted ways to show off their wealth, fine wool and furs. These goods reached people on the manor by way of a fair. Merchants and craftspeople of local goods set up tents or stalls to display and sell their goods. Fairs occurred regularly and often took place on holidays or holy days or during celebrations. A network of European trade routes developed to serve these fairs. Traders developed standard or regular trade routes. Along these routes, traders and merchants exchanged local goods for foreign goods. A trader did not need to travel to the markets of Asia. Instead, goods from Asia would reach a trader through a series of middlemen, rather like a relay race. The European trade routes linked to Muslim trade routes, providing goods from Africa, Asia Minor, and other Muslim lands. For goods from China and the Far East, European trade routes linked to the primary trade route through Asia, the Silk Road, one of the oldest and most important land routes. We have a map at the top of the next page that shows the Silk Road, where it was, and then also Marco Polo's route as well. The Silk Road. We know much about the Silk Road from the travels of Marco Polo. His accounts of China's riches fascinated Europeans. At about 4,000 miles in length, the Silk Road was not one single route across Central Asia. It was several different routes and branches, each passing through different settlements. However, all routes set out from the Chinese capital, Chang'an, under the Han Dynasty. They all reached Dunhuang on the edge of the Taklamakan, I slaughtered that, Taklamakan, maybe, desert. At Dunhuang, the road branched. The northern route, which led to Baghdad, is shown above on the map. Caravans to China carried gold, ivory, and precious stones. Caravans from China brought silk, furs, ceramics, jade, bronze objects, lacquer, and iron. Ideas traveled both ways. Buddhism came to China via the Silk Road. The Silk Road was physically difficult to travel. In addition, bandits made travel dangerous. Caravans needed their own defense forces. In some places, forts and defensive walls were constructed along part of the route to protect the caravans. In 1271, Marco Polo left Venice, Italy, for Shangtu. Under the Mongols, Polo remained in China as a guest for 17 years. In his writings, he describes how Genghis Khan unified the region. He then made himself master of cities and provinces and appointed governors to them. Once the numerous states in the region were united under the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road became an important path for communication between different parts of the empire. When the Silk Road came under the protection of the Mongols, it became safe for travel. The Plague. When medieval culture was at its greatest strength, the plague hit Europe. The plague was a bubonic plague, a very aggressive epidemic, or the rapid spread of a disease over a wide area. Bacteria, usually carried by rodents, carried the plague. A bubonic plague occurs when fleas infect rodents, usually rats, and then they move to humans. The fleas then transfer the bacteria from the rat through the bite to the human. The rat and the human die, while the flea lives. Today we know how a bubonic plague spreads. However, in the 14th century, no one knew how and why the plague spread. As one account says, "And from what this epidemic came, all wise teachers and physicians could only say that it was God's will. Some historians suggest that the plague began in Central Asia in the late 1320s and spread east to China. The plague then spread west along the Silk Road, reaching the Black Sea by 1347. The first European case of the disease started in Genoa, Italy. An epidemic in a seaport town such as Genoa is especially dangerous. Ships from all directions came to and from Genoa. As a result, rats could spread the plague from country to country in ships. People were terrified that they would get the plague. Some thought they could get it by looking at someone who had the plague. Here is an eyewitness account from Agnolo de Tura of Siena. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown into those ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. They have a chart there that shows what the effects of the plague are. 25 to 33% population loss in Europe. Let me translate that. That means 1 in every 4 people to 1 in every 3 people in Europe died of the plague. Businesses go bankrupt, deaths cause labor shortages, trade declines and towns disappear, construction and building projects stop, and food supply decreases and people starve. An attack of bubonic plague does not last long, but the disease has a very high death rate. The plague killed about 1/4 to 1/3 of Europe's population from 1347 to 1352. Despite the negative effects of the plague, which is what's in that chart. Fewer people meant that the serfs became more valuable to the lords. Serfs enjoyed a higher standard of living and more independence. Thanks for listening.